Scott Johnston, welcome to the Free Trail Podcast. Thanks for doing this.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Dylan. It's a real pleasure. I've watched your work for several years now, so I'm honored to be a part of this whole podcast.
Well, the honor is mine, and it's funny too because I have heard your name around the scene for a long time. I read your book, The Uphill Athlete, and this is our first time actually connecting and talking one-on-one, and I'm sure we've got a lot of ground to cover here. You, of course, being the coach to the double champions at UTMB, Ruth Croft and Tom Evans. And I've been doing just some digging and some research, and I feel like you do bring a very novel approach to training, and I'm really excited to talk about it. But before we dive into it, I got to pose my traditional opening question to you, Scott, something I ask everybody who comes on the show. That is, what makes you you in moments of introspection? What are your strengths and weaknesses? How do they show up in your life?
Well, I suppose keeping this in the general realm of athletics and coaching and training ideas and that sort of thing, I would say that in my background, I've never been an ultra runner. I mean, I have tremendous admiration for anybody that even willing to stand on the starting line of these races. It's amazing to me. My background comes from different sports, but my real educational and professional background is in engineering and math. And I think I bring, one of the things that engineers do is try to solve problems. And I think I bring this sort of outside the box problem solving mentality to my coaching, because my coaching history, somewhat, I can be brief about this, but I started coaching mostly in the world of cross-country ski racing. And ended up coaching at a fairly high level in that for 15 years. And I didn't know, I'd had a ski career myself when I was younger, but I was asked to start coaching a junior team at one point, and I volunteered to put my hand up and then very quickly went, oh shit, I don't really know anything about coaching. So I did this kind of deep dive to learning, have to stay one step ahead of the kids with my kind of training theory and all that. So I started looking at, because there's not much written in English about training for cross-country skiing, I started reading about other sports. And the training theory for endurance sports in general isn't that different. And so I began to put these pieces together, and I ended up creating a pretty successful program. And 4 of my skiers were on the 2014 Olympic team. But I think it was that curiosity and sort of outside the box, like, hey, here's a problem, let's see how we can fix it, or we can understand this better. So I'd say that's probably certainly one of my strengths, is that.
Bringing the engineer and the mathematician mindset to training. I love it. So maybe let's first start by just talking about this current moment. How are you absorbing this monumental achievement? I have to imagine that this is one of, if not the highlight of your coaching career. How is the double victory landed for you?
Well, it was a very exciting day. Of course, I can't begin to even convey the emotion for me. I mean, this has been, I've been in this world coaching it's at quite a high level for almost 30 years. And this was kind of a culmination. A lot of the ideas that I've been using with athletes over years and years, the same thing, and we'll probably talk about some of those later with Tom and Ruth. But it was like, oh, this was the culmination of all of that. And so it wasn't, an overnight sensation. I mean, it's a lot of years in the trenches to get to this point. So, but it was incredibly satisfying. I'm very lucky to have been able to be part of the team that, put those 2 on the podium. So that's rewarding. And I never have had really any kind of social media presence. And I was told beforehand I should have an Instagram account. And I can see how people who are actually famous must just get sick of. I'm really thrilled that I've gotten so many congratulatory messages, but mine are a handful compared to real famous people. But I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of Instagram, direct messages, text, emails, and I'm very grateful for all those. And I think I've answered all of them. If I haven't and you're out there, I apologize. I'll hopefully get to it. But I'm almost ready to crawl back under my little obscure rock and just go back to being a coach and not being so much in the limelight. I'm not really used to that.
Yeah. All right. Well, don't crawl under that rock for like about another hour so that we can get all your well-earned wisdom in this 30-year culmination. And I loved how you said being part of the team that made this happen. And that's something I do want to spend a little time on, knowing that Ruth and Tom do share multiple sort of team leadership members, yourself included, but we'll come back to that here momentarily. Like I said, I've heard your name around the scene for a long time, and you've mentioned this yourself, but you do come from sort of a non-traditional coaching background compared to a lot of the other high-level coaches in trail running. And I'd love to have you just kind of talk in general about the advancement of mountain sport coaching in general. You came up at a time 30 years ago when there wasn't a lot of information, certainly when it was a lot harder to, educate yourself on the subject matter. So share how you ended up on this career path and how you ended up coaching runners specifically after the start with cross-country skiing.
Well, the skier, it started actually, my rise into real coaching besides coaching skiers was I wrote a book along with a co-author, Steve House. We wrote a book called Training for the New Alpinism. Yeah. And it was published in about 2013. I had been coaching Steve through most of the kind of the highlight years of his career, where he became considered to be, one of, if not the best alpinist in the world. Mm-hmm. And that sort of launched a little bit of a kind of a mini coaching business, because in general, mountaineers and alpinists don't train, they just go climbing all the time. But somebody that I think your audience is pretty familiar with, a guy named Kilian Jornet, read that book and got in touch with me, and he said, "Hey, I really like what you did with that book." As you know, Kilian has a background in exercise science. So he understood the theories and the principles I was laying out and how they could be applied really to any sort of endurance sport. And he said, "But I think you need to write another one of these that's more geared towards running and ski mountaineering, because people are going to pick up that Training for the New Alpinism. Even if they're runners, they're going to look at all those crazy, scary pictures of climbers, and they're going to just go, well, this isn't for me,' and put it back without really realizing there's a lot of valuable information there that could pertain to them." And I said, "Well, yeah, I'd be interested in doing that if you would co-author it with me." And he said, "Sure." And I was very fortunate. He was unfortunate, but I was very fortunate, because in the very first skimo race of that winter, he broke the tibia and fibula in his leg, boot top. And so he was on the couch for about 8 weeks. And as you know from Kilian, he doesn't sit still very long. And so it was fortunate for me that I had him pinned down and we could actually collaborate on the book for that whole period of time. And I owe a great deal to Kilian, because these same ideas that I put forth in the first book and then in the Training for the Uphill Athlete book are ideas I had been using with skiers for decades. But if it hadn't been for Kilian's name on that book, I don't think the book would have had any traction, because who am I? I'm just no name at all. And so that I owe him a great deal for that. And that's actually what brought Tom Evans to me. Was Tom read the book and said, "I like the sound of this, and it's somewhat unconventional." And Tom came to me about 4 years ago, and was willing to take a flyer with me, basically. Yeah. And I was coaching. I'd started coaching someone who's well known in the ultra running community, Luke Nelson. I started coaching Luke about 10 years ago. Yep. Right about the time that first book came out, he approached me and asked for some help with coaching. But that was my first runner, ultra runner that I'd ever worked with. Yeah.
Luke's a longtime friend of mine. I believe he coaches with Evoke now too, your coaching business, right?
Yeah. He's been actually with us for a long time.
Yeah. He responded to me when I put out some sort of a feeler about like, hey, I want to get Scott on the podcast. He was like, oh, I'll hook you up. So shout out Luke Nelson. And I want to come back to how you and Tom came to be connected, because I've actually talked to him about it too. And I think the audience would find it interesting, but maybe dwelling on this for another minute. Of course, like the alpinism and cross-country skiing background is different. Like when you reflect on that, what do you think, what did it teach you about trail running? Like what aspects of the training that you were doing with Steve House and then as you were moving into cross-country skiing mapped most effectively to trail running?
Well, I think that, and this is something that I learned during my journey of learning about training theory and principles. I absorbed a lot of information that came out of the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet system. When the Soviet Union fell apart, a lot of that information suddenly made its way into the West. And so we were able to see what Soviet sports scientists were saying. And one of the earliest books I got from that was written by I could get this nationality, Hungarian, I believe, Tudor Bompa, and it's called The Theory and Methodology of Training. And it's an incredible textbook. And I read it, and at the time I thought, wait a minute, this guy's coaching everything from like baseball players to runners. How does that fit into the, how do you do that? How do you understand training theory across these multiple sports, from speed and powers type sports like ball sports to endurance sports like running and cross-country skiing, rowing, cycling, all that. And because I'd come from this world or this thought, the way I'd grown up as an athlete was thinking, well, no, if you are a cross-country skier, then you can, or if you're a cross-country ski coach, you can only coach cross-country skiers. But then when I saw how the Eastern European and especially that Soviet sports science methodology and their education system worked, is no, they teach training theory. And if you understand the training theory, you will need to understand the technical challenges of each of these different sports, of course, which are quite different. But when you think about it from a metabolic or physiological standpoint, if you're front pointing up the north face of the Eiger or you're running a 10K in the local city park, your calves don't know any different. It's just muscle contracting and doing their muscle thing. And so it really opened my mind up to thinking, well, there is this big sort of intellectual framework that governs training for sports. And, I was mostly interested in the endurance side of sports. So I began to dive in deeper and deeper into the Soviet system and just look at what had come out of that once the Soviet Union broke apart. Many of these articles got translated into books, and articles got translated into English. And I just began to consume those. And I thought, oh, I never thought of it this way. That there's kind of a grand unifying theory, if you will, behind these behind training for endurance. And so we can look at what a cyclist does and relate it to trail running or cross-country skiing. And I think it was a real watershed moment for me. And then I had to go, because I was an engineer and I had the last biology class I'd had was in 8th grade, I had to suddenly teach myself physiology too. So I had to, so now I've got the kind of the training theory aside, but then I'm lacking on the physiology side. So I just dove into that as well. But in the process of that, I think it really helped me realize that we could, we still do at Evoke. We train mountaineers, alpinists. We do a lot of work with special operations teams in the U.S. Because their sport, if you will, their event is an ultra endurance event. And so what I've seen is there are these commonalities. Yes, they have their technical differences for sure. And we don't pretend to try to train the soldiers, on the tactical side of things. But it does allow, if you have this grasp, I think, of that overarching framework I was talking about, it does allow you to kind of move more fluidly in that world.
So interesting. And yeah, the endurance aspect is the commonality between alpinism, ski mountaineering, cross-country skiing, trail running, special operations. And it feels like the thing that ties all of this together and that at least you have become known for now is this idea of fatigue resistance or muscular endurance. And I have to say, I hadn't really heard much about this school of thought myself personally. I'm sure it's not necessarily something that you pioneered, but it's now going to be very much in the zeitgeist and in the lexicon of trail runners. So maybe just start with the definition, like what is fatigue resistance? How did this become sort of the governing principle of your training?
Well, this will, yeah, you're right. I didn't invent any of this stuff. I might have compiled things into, a more digestible size for people to understand and to grasp. And that was certainly my hope with Training for the Uphill Athlete book. But all these ideas have been kicked around and talked about for decades, if not even longer. The thing that all endurance sports share is fatigue. I mean, that is what separates the winners from the also ran, is the one who fatigues the least is going to win the race or is going to perform better on the climb or whatever. And so how do we understand where that fatigue is coming from? And then how can we make the athlete resistant to that fatigue? And one of the concepts that I picked up again from the Soviet system is this idea of local muscular fatigue is the kind of the way they talked about it. And when they're talking about local fatigue, and I think people in your audience will certainly be able to grasp this, there's kind of a global fatigue, and anybody who's ever bonked has felt global fatigue. But there's also this local muscular fatigue that happens in the main propelling muscles that causes you to slow down. And it's certainly, it happens in every endurance event. That's I believe, my personal belief is that's the biggest thing that makes people slow down in their event is local muscular fatigue. And certainly when we get into events that last many hours, where central nervous system fatigue becomes one of the dominant types of fatigue, then what's going to happen is, your brain can't fire those motor units that are otherwise allowing you to run at race pace. And because the nervous system becomes so fatigued. And so how can we train an athlete to become resistant to that type of fatigue? And so this concept of local muscular fatigue, which I've kind of shortened to muscular endurance, or how does that relate to fatigue resistance? They're kind of intertwined that way. They're interlinked. But I was heavily influenced because I spent a short and not very successful period on the U.S. ski team as a cross-country skier and did a few World Cup races, but never with any real success. But during that time, I was fortunate to become exposed to someone who few people in your audience might remember the name of Peter Snell. It's the only person to have ever won the 800 and the 1500 in the same Olympics.
Okay.
He's a New Zealand runner. And that was in 1964 that he did both of those. Well, he went on to get a doctorate in exercise science at the University of Texas, where a good friend of mine was running the exercise physiology program at the time. And I got introduced to this concept that Peter Snell was working on in his doctoral thesis, which was, what is the correlation? What are the things that are best predictors of endurance performance among athletes? And he looked at running economy, the speed at the second threshold, which we could call, that has a lot of different names, but anaerobic threshold would be one that people are probably familiar with in this, and then VO2 max. Mm-hmm. And how do those things respectively correlate to an athlete's endurance performance? And what he did was he took, over the previous decade, I think it was starting in around 1970 to 1980, he looked at the winning marathon times around the world. And then he ranked those athletes by their known best 10K times, which would give you an indication perhaps of their second threshold speed.
Okay.
And he also ranked them by their known VO2 max if they had been recorded. And what he found was that VO2 max was by far the worst predictor of performance.
Interesting.
That it had a correlation of about 60%. It could explain about 60% of the difference among. Now he was dealing with a fairly small cohort of athletes. Granted, someone like Killian with a VO2 max of 90 something is always going to be faster than somebody with a VO2 max of 50. Those are not relatable. But if you took the top 10 people, let's say at several of these ultra races, and you ranked them by VO2 max, it would be a very poor correlation, almost, like I said, about 60%. But what he found was the correlation of the speed at their second threshold, this anaerobic threshold, was about 95% accurate predictor. So and then what I went on to learn from the Soviets was that the biggest limitation, and I've observed this now with skiers and runners and other athletes, is that the biggest limitation to the speed you can sustain at that second threshold is, in fact, local muscular fatigue.
Okay.
So if we can improve, I know this is kind of going down in the weeds, and I hope people are following.
This is perfect. This is great.
But if we can improve the athlete's ability to sustain that speed at that second threshold for longer without fatiguing, they're going to have better race results.
Yeah.
And we can kind of we can, and especially amongst a cohort or amongst the elites, we can kind of put aside VO2 max because, if you're someone like Tom or Ruth, we're not going to move your VO2 max, maybe a point or two if we're really lucky with certain types of training. But most athletically mature people will not have much luck changing their VO2 max. I've seen it. I've got documents of athletes I've followed for over 10 years. I mean, a good example would be, Lance Armstrong, whose VO2 max actually went down during his career, despite the fact that his results got better. Now, obviously, there's some mitigating factors there, but clearly VO2 max wasn't one of the main factors. So going back to this limitation due to the fatigue, if we can figure out a way to enhance or improve their fatigue resistance, we're going to be able to make those athletes run faster for longer. And one of the reasons that I think, especially in very long endurance events, that VO2 max doesn't play as big a role is you're never operating anywhere near VO2 max. Yeah. Or if you do, you're going to probably have a very bad race or a short race. Yeah. Whereas you're going to be most of these, I have all the data from Tom and Ruth and other athletes. In these long races that last, let's say 8 or 10 hours up to 20, they're operating somewhere in the range between the first and second threshold, between the aerobic and anaerobic threshold. They spend almost all their time in there. And most of it's even close down near the aerobic threshold, the first threshold. So that kind of gives you the thinking behind this methodology. So then we think about, okay, how do we improve fatigue resistance? Well, we want to increase the load on those local propelling muscles somehow. And you can do it by doing traditional high intensity interval training. And anybody who's ever done, let's say what we might call zone 4 or VO2 max type training, that your legs end up being the limiter there. Your legs give out. You can't finish the interval session because, okay, I can't hit my times anymore. I was doing, mile repeats or something, and I no longer can do that because my legs are getting tired. But what I discovered, and this was going back to my skiers, because I had this exact experience with them, I would go to do with them a traditional VO2 max or zone 4 type interval session. And the first couple repetitions would go pretty well, but then they'd just start getting slower and slower and slower. And we'd see the heart rate decline in each repetition, meaning that those muscles can't propel them fast enough anymore. And as you know, the heart is kind of responding to the demand from the muscles. So the heart just slows down. That's why you see a reduced heart rate. And I thought, well, what if we did something that would make their legs so they weren't getting tired in these workouts before we did this VO2 max training? And so what we did was heavy resistance training, not heavy by meaning heavy weights, but high repetitions with a low to moderate weight. And what I found, if we did, 8 weeks, an 8-week block of this fatigue resistance building training, and then we went into a more traditional interval style training, that they could then complete the whole interval workout and maintain the speed because their legs didn't become the limiter.
Because they have the muscular endurance.
They have that muscular endurance. So the cool part then was, if you're going to be doing VO2 max training, then you want to be training at VO2 max or close to it. Whereas if you do the first 2 repetitions are at VO2 max, but then you just get slower and slower, you're no longer training VO2 max. You're training what I used to say, it's making you tougher because it really is painful, but it's not necessarily making you faster.
Oh, unfortunately, brutal.
They do not give the awards away to the toughest people. They give them away to the fastest people. So what I began to see is that if I use this methodology with my skiers, and we did everything, crazy things like, in the summertime, dragging tires up hills. That was a really common thing. They would roller ski with weight vests.
Okay. I want you to provide a couple of examples here, because I think the audience it's like the natural next step after you providing this broader definition of muscular endurance and how you arrived at it. And I read the I Run Far article that they published about you in the aftermath of Ruth and Tom's victory. And you basically say, the heart isn't the thing that gets tired in these races. It's the muscles. And so it's all about training the muscles. You're just listing some of the things you did with the cross-country skiers. But in the I Run Far article, they say things like steep uphill hiking, downhill repeats, weight vests, tire drags. So maybe you could take 1 or 2 examples from Tom and Ruth's build specifically of like how you enhanced muscular endurance. Sure.
Well, there's the cool part about muscular endurance training is there's a lot of different ways to skin that cat. And, as long as you are feeling that fatigue in those propelling muscles, you're getting a muscular endurance training effect. Mm-hmm. So almost any way you can devise to do that. You may have, I'm sure Jack Kunzel, one of our coaches, and Jack coached Caleb Olson for his win at Western States.
That's right, man. You guys are on a roll this season.
And he had Caleb doing heavy weighted backpack hikes up the hill, the mountains right outside of Salt Lake City. He had Caleb with a backpack on a Stairmaster. I did the same, Tom and Ruth, same thing. Put a pack on, get on the Stairmaster, or go outside and run uphill. Now, for some people, they won't even need a weight vest or a pack with weight in it. In fact, when Killian and I were having this muscular endurance, not debate, but discussion for the book, I talked to him about this, and he hadn't ever thought of it in these terms. But he said, I do my muscular endurance training by doing long zone 3 uphill repetitions, without any weight. And so you can get this training effect in many different ways. Now, I'll tell you why I've chosen to go the weighted route. And that is that high intensity training, you and I'm sure almost all of your listeners will know, it has a huge global fatiguing component to it. You do a hard interval session one day, you're going to be impacted by that for several days after in terms of how you're going to be able to absorb training going forward. What I have found with this local muscular endurance type of training is that there is a big local fatigue component in the legs, but the global fatigue is not that great.
This is a fascinating point. Yeah.
It doesn't have as much impact on the athlete's ability to handle subsequent training sessions. And so that's the main reason I shifted to this, high resistance weighted training, whether it's, we do some of it. Like when I first started working with Tom and Ruth, I didn't have them doing these weighted uphill workouts. There's a gym muscular endurance program that's, it's for free. It's in the book. It's on our website. You can download a PDF for it. And it's a progression over 10 or 12 weeks of how to build this in a gym, not outdoors training. So you can do it in the wintertime with bad weather. And I had both of them run through that at least once or twice, that 10 or 12 week block. in the first couple of years I worked with them, before I felt like they were strong enough. No, okay, now let's start adding some weight on the body and going uphill with it. And so for them, a typical workout, I'm not going to go into the details of that gym muscular endurance because people can find it on the website, evokeendurance.com. But the weighted stuff for them basically was done at an intensity and with a weight that's just heavy enough to cause this, have the limiting factor be the fatigue in the legs, not the breathing or the heart rate. The heart rate and the breathing will go up, but we're not concerned. Normally we might try to control the intensity by, using heart rate limits and that sort of thing. But in this case, heart rate and breathing, they go out the window. We're just interested in getting this fatigue in the legs. And so a strong athlete will be able to use and need to use a heavier weight than, someone who's less strong. And for many people, just literally going uphill will be enough stimulus to give them that muscular endurance effect. But for an elite athlete, or not even an elite, but at a high level, someone who's got a lot of training history, and especially if they have strong legs, they're going to want to have some kind of weight on their back somehow. And the problem with a weight vest is you have to get it back downhill. And with Ruth, we were lucky because Martin was able to carry the weight vest downhill for her in these sessions. And in her case, we were able, Tom, to pretty much use a standard 3 by 20 minute protocol with a short, 2 or 3 minute walk in between. And then they would, whatever the terrain was, if it was runnable, they would run. And if it wasn't runnable, they would be hiking.
Okay. Yeah. And I think just at a finer point, I think the most fascinating thing to me is this global fatigue versus local fatigue idea. And I pulled a quote from the RN4 article that I think drives it home in an elegant way and reinforces basically what you just said. You said, I'm trying to get the same muscular effect that you would get from VO2 max intervals, but without the global fatigue cost. You don't elevate cortisol, you don't elevate lactate, and recovery is much faster. So you can then stack more volume. At least that was my interpretation. Coming back to using other tools to enhance this muscular endurance, both Tom and Ruth mentioned to me that they were doing stuff. I think they said treadmill, but maybe Stairmaster also. So how did you utilize a tool like a treadmill and a Stairmaster specifically? And was this something that you also did in a weighted context?
First of all, with some reluctance, the Stairmaster was not a big hit with either Tom or Ruth. I might have gotten a hard no from Ruth, or maybe she didn't have access to one. I don't remember. And Tom was tolerant and put up with it a little bit until he could get to Chamonix and get outdoors. And so, but I have used it before with others, and it is an incredibly. 10 years ago, I would have poo-pooed a Stairmaster as being, something. I don't know who would use it, but it wouldn't be an athlete. But I've since seen such incredible results with it that for people who live in what we would call terrain challenged areas, it's an incredibly good tool for being able to training to go uphill. Boring as hell, but it is a useful tool. So we did minimal of that, I would say, with both of them because of their somewhat resistance to it. But we did use incline treadmill for both of them extensively. And Tom has one that will go to 25%, and Ruth has one that will go to 20%. And so there were certain workouts we did there that were weighted, but others that were also unweighted, that were more in that traditional interval style, unweighted type of training. Mm-hmm. But we do, one other thing I should probably say is that the external people, besides this concept of local and global fatigue, which I think are important for people to at least recognize, if not completely understand, is the notion of external and internal load. So the external load is what the coach tells you to do. You're going to go do this particular workout. And it's easy to quantify that. And especially, we can use all the data that comes from these fancy watches that we all have that can give us a pretty good idea of what the athlete did in terms of heart rate elevation and all that. But it doesn't tell us anything about the internal load. And I believe that the body's response to the external load is really critical. And so we heavily rely on blood lactate testing during the training to make sure that the internal load is where we want it to be. So these workouts on the treadmill and the reason I did that short segue was that these workouts on the treadmill that were in the more traditional interval style were also very carefully controlled in terms of their lactate, because we were not looking for VO2 max stimulus. We were still looking for something in that between the two threshold type stimulus.
Yeah, so interesting. All right, so one more general thing before we talk more specifically about the training and then the race management itself. The pole integration was also something that has come up in conversation with both Tom and Ruth. I remember when Tom first started working with you, I think it was around the time of his original podium finish at UTMB, or maybe just after. But I remember I think he posted a photo or a video of himself on a treadmill with like a ski erg that was simulating the poles. And then Ruth had mentioned that you guys really focused on building upper body strength with the poles, and that they effectively are using more of the upper body strength or building muscular endurance in the upper body also in a way that obviously brought them around the course faster than anybody else. So share a little bit about poles and upper body strength too. Sure.
Well, actually when I first started working with Tom, he had knee surgery in December of 2021. And that's when I started. Right after that, January of 2022 is when I began working with him. And I've noticed when I've watched trail runners in races that I see them carrying their poles, and they are going through a poling type motion, but I don't really see much propulsion coming out of it. And coming from a cross-country skiing background, I'm just thinking, this is a wasted opportunity here, because we are by nature, evolutionarily, we're quadrupedal animals. And one of the reasons, speaking of VO2 max, cross-country skiers typically cannot reach their VO2 max without using poles. Until they get all that more muscle mass involved, their heart's capable of producing more blood than they're able to use, essentially, or more oxygen than they can use. So I look at people, kind of ineffectually using their poles in trail running, and I thought, well, that's because they're not skiers. And so I began to show Tom some of this stuff. And actually that idea of I have a skier in front of my treadmill in my gym that I've been training athletes on for 20 some years. And I have a picture of, I think some other athletes on it. But anyway, Tom got that idea, and he has a ski erg anyway. And I said, well, just push your treadmill over in front of that thing, and that's what you're going to use. And neither one of them were resistant at all, but Tom's had a little longer time to work on it than Ruth did. I've been working with Ruth now for 3 years and Tom for 4. And so what we do with it is we use the ski erg quite a bit, but we don't use it as an endurance training tool because it's so boring. It's worse than the Stairmaster. You're just standing there moving your arms, and it becomes very boring. So what we use it for is an interval session, kind of an interval protocol to build muscular endurance. So we put it on the ski erg is essentially a concept to rowing machine stood on its head, and so we put it on its highest resistance level and do things like 30-30s or, a couple minutes on, a minute off, that sort of, just something to keep the variety. And that way we can keep those workouts relatively short, in the 15, 20-minute range so they don't go crazy. And then we also do strength work. So like good old-fashioned heavy resistance, fairly low repetition, kind of lat pull type work for poling. And I think both of them have noticed a significant improvement, and especially this year. It's like taken a few years for them to even become efficient with their poles. And I think that's one of the problems with runners is because they're not really used to, using their arms. They are not, any sport has a technique to it. And most people would think, well, heck, running or walking or poling, those things don't seem like they're very technique heavy, but they do require some coordination, and it takes a while to learn. So we had a big emphasis on that. And then they could they're doing these gym sessions, but then when they went outdoors to do their running on the trails, they were more effective with those. And then they'd get their endurance training out on the trails with their poles.
Yeah, so interesting. Okay, so moving from kind of the science of training to more of the art, I think the audience would be really interested, and certainly I would too, for you to just share what makes Tom and Ruth special. They've obviously both been so successful in their careers, even predating their work with you.
Yeah.
You get to see them day to day. In fact, I think Ruth said in that I Run Far article that outside of her partner, Martin, you're like the number one person she communicates with every day. So what makes Tom and Ruth as individuals as special as they are as athletes?
One word, and it's talent. And, when you have a talented athlete, it makes the coach look really good. But I have to say that I am so lucky to have such talented athletes to work with, because I've used this same technique with many athletes, hundreds of athletes for many, many years, and I see it working. But the confluence of I think, good training with a talented athlete, and then having two talented athletes in the same race. I mean, that was like the stars aligned perfectly there. But it really, truly is a rarity I've coached athletes to very high level at world class in skiing who didn't have the talent to be a world champion. Now I've got these two athletes that they've got the talent to be the best in the world in those particular races. So as much as I would like to claim that I was the reason that they're on that podium, I'm playing a part for sure, but it's really them, the genetics that they're bringing to the party are really what made them so successful.
Can you share a little bit about the day-to-day interaction? Like the fact that Ruth said that makes me feel that obviously you're very involved in not only prescribing the training, but providing analysis and feedback in real time. How often are you guys communicating? And if you can share just like what that communication looks like, I'd be really interested. Every single day.
Very rarely does a day go by that we're not at some level of communication. We, like I'm sure many of your listeners, use Training Peaks as our means of planning and laying out the training. And that little comment box in Training Peaks where they write down how the workout went is key, because that's our first line of communication. I want to know, it won't be in every workout. If they're going for a recovery run, I don't expect them to write 100 words about how that felt. But if there's a workout of some sort, then they know that I'm expecting some detail in there, whether it's lactate levels or pace or just their perception of how it felt. I need to know that, because I can see the data, but it's more, like I said, I want to know that internal load. So our first line of communication will always be through that Training Peaks comment box. And then if there's something that arises there or piques my interest, then we will be WhatsApp texting about it and just asking, okay, how did your legs feel in this thing today? Given that what we did this other thing 2 days ago, how are your legs feeling today before the workout? I can even ask them before they go out to train and say, if your legs are feeling a little flat today, hey, let's push to what we had planned for today to tomorrow. Just do a recovery spin on the bike or whatever it's going to be. Mm-hmm. And then we communicate by telephone and Zoom, probably not as frequently because it's just not as convenient. Mm-hmm. But if we need to discuss some bigger, whether it's a strategy thing about an upcoming race or debriefing, like just before this call with you, I was on a lengthy debrief call with Tom about his race, doing one with Ruth on the weekend. So the community.
I wish I could sit in on those, buddy.
could sell admission to those.
Yeah, come on.
But they are super valuable. But I think this came about because, we do this. Every coach does with every athlete at Evoke, and the reason is that I kind of taught them this trade and this technique, because I know from my days when I was coaching skiing, where I was actually with the skiers almost every day, I was able to see them, and you can see their body language, you can measure lactates, you can hear their breathing, you can see their moods, how are they grumpy today? Maybe we shouldn't do that interval session. And we don't have the luxury of that with Ruth in New Zealand and Tom in England and athletes spread all around the world. And so I needed to create something as close to that as we could with our remote coaching. And so because I believe that the tighter the kind of the communication and the partnership is with your athlete, the better the results are going to be. So we rely very heavily on that communication aspect.
Yeah, I also watched the interview that you did with Dirk Friel from Training Peaks, and you make this point about how oftentimes a limiting factor in a coach-athlete relationship is the communication, and that it does take, I don't know, maybe time to learn how to properly communicate from an athlete's perspective, the appropriate information to help you do your job better. I don't know if it'd be fun to spend a minute talking about that. I'm sure there's a lot of runners in our audience with coaches. How could they enhance their communication to help their coach do their job better?
Yeah, I think more information is always going to be better. I mean, I think I mentioned jokingly, but it's not that far off. I mean, I get, we at Evoke get text or comments in that Training Peaks comment box that are little novels sometimes. Yeah. Here's what I did with my kids today, or or my wife and I had a fight. And so but the more information that the coach has, the better that they can sense that internal load that I'm talking about, and the better job they're going to be able to do in regulating the external load going forward and making changes on site. So, and the longer you work with the coach, the better that partnership becomes. And, I learned this when I was coaching the skiers. We'd sometimes start a workout and I would see their body language, or I'd measure their lactate, and I'd just say, we're done. We're not doing this today. And Tom and Ruth now, and other athletes I coach, I have now gotten to the point where they can do the same thing. They start the warm up and they go, I can tell this isn't going to happen today. I'm not going to feel it, because there's no point in imposing that external load if your body's not ready to absorb it. Yeah. It's counterproductive, and in fact, it can be quite harmful. So through this process of close communication, you can educate the athlete, because again, the fact that they're halfway around the world, I can't be the one that says, no, we're not doing that today. And oftentimes, this was the first time I noticed with Tom, and that made me realize, oh, he really gets this. He's understanding it. Was a couple of years ago, I'd write out a week of training, and then I'd go back in and look at, on Tuesday, we had planned to do this. And I noticed, well, that's no longer on Tuesday. Now it's on Wednesday. And I thought, did I do that? Did I move that? And I realized, no, he went in there and go, I know I'm not ready for Tuesday. I'm going to push it over to Wednesday and do something.
That's so interesting. Today. And that's how you're doing your job well, when he can make that adjustment.
When he makes that on the fly, because he's the one who's there in real time needing to make that.
Okay, so this feels like a good time to come back to the team around Tom and Ruth outside of yourself, because it feels like communication is going to be important here. Not only yourself, but Tom and Ruth share Paul Booth, I think is his name, on the nutrition side. And then Joseph, whose last name I can never remember, who's the
Mestrellet.
Mestrellet, the PhD data scientist that we talked about all week at UTMB. Yes. Yep. Talk about that little small team, how you guys communicate together to increase the chances of success of Tom and Ruth.
Yeah, sure. It wasn't until, so Ruth recruited Joseph a couple of years ago to help her with a pacing plan, because that's kind of his specialty, is data analysis. And then last year, right before, and then that was the year that she didn't do UTMB. I was coaching her then, but she got sick excuse me, sick right before, didn't do it. Then last year, about 2 weeks before UTMB, she said, hey, I'm working with this guy. He's doing the coach pacing plan. She sent me all this stuff, and I was very impressed. And I thought, this is really interesting. So I got together with Joseph, and we talked about the pacing plan for Ruth last year, which, as you know, was rather radical in terms of how slow she went out.
Yeah.
But so then after Tom had another DNF last year, I said, Tom, I really think we need to pull somebody else in here. And we brought Joseph in to start working on the data analysis side of things. And then we got Paul involved in terms of nutrition. And it was about that time when I realized, all I've been doing is supplying just this one little piece of the puzzle here. Yes, it's a critical part, but there's so much more to planning the strategy for these, not so much around the training. They're not as involved in training. They're more involved as we get closer to races to help with the pacing or the nutrition plan. But it really became apparent to me the importance of having this team to work with both of them. And I think it was certainly a huge contributing factor to their success this year.
It's so interesting. Okay, so spending a little bit of time, spending a little time on the athletes themselves individually. Ruth had said that she knew she needed to start more aggressively this year. So maybe you could share a little bit about, like, what was there anything you did in training to build off of her amazing second place in 2024, knowing that she wanted to be more aggressive?
No, the training didn't change. Okay. It was a sort of a natural progression. There were no changes in the components of the training. I think we did a little better job in the lead up in the final, let's say 6 to 8 weeks building to the race. In consistency, she did have a little sickness, and that derailed things for a couple of weeks. But overall, I think that part went pretty much the same as it had every year the last 3 years. But she was training at a slightly higher level because, as I get to know her and Tom, well, for instance, the first year I worked with Tom, he was so undertrained at UTMB because I'd only been working with this guy for 6 or 8 months, and I just didn't want to cook him. And so I was very conservative with the approach. But over the years, I've been able to realize, whoa, this guy's got an incredible work capacity. He can handle more. And we just keep, and same with Ruth. So we've been gradually increasing the training load over that time. But in terms of really changing on my side of things, no. But on Joseph's side of things with the pacing, yes. And then, of course, there was the monkey wrench that got thrown into it with the change of the course before the race, and then, of course, the change of the course during the race that made some of those pacing plans go out the window. And Joseph was on the computer trying to recalculate pacing plans and then sending information to Martin about what to tell Ruth in the aid station. So it was kind of an on-the-fly thing this year because of the conditions. Okay,
I want to come back to that in a second, but same thing with Tom. You've sort of just mentioned it now, but he can handle a lot of training. And I heard you say in the Training Peaks conversation that this was the biggest load that he had ever carried coming into UTMB. Share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I'm a believer that the quality sessions in the week are the key sessions for an elite athlete. Now, if you're very, very new to endurance training, then the aerobic base sessions are the key sessions for anyone, because if you don't have a big aerobic base, piling on all this sexy stuff just really not going to work for you, not going to work well. And it can actually lead to some bad stuff. So I'm a big believer on, you got to have this aerobic base. You got to have your aerobic house in order. Once you have that, then we're just going to be maintaining that with the volume. But the key sessions through the week are the key sessions. We need to hit those, and then let the volume be what it may. Well, it turns out with Tom, it can be 200 kilometers a week and several key hard sessions in the week too. So he has this incredible work capacity. And Ruth is similar in that, she's not training very differently than Tom, honestly. And even, she's training, when they do their track work, it's just, 10 seconds per kilometer different than Tom.
No way.
Yeah.
Wow.
So for similar lactate levels too. I mean, they're both of them have a very good speed, high speed for this type of sport. So I would say that, the way that it reveals itself to me is, hey, we get these key sessions in, and then you fill in the rest with easy volume. Like, okay, I'm saying you need to go do this easy, we're going to do 2 easy runs this day. Well, and I'm saying they should be a couple of hours. Well, if you feel really good, maybe it's going to be 2.5 or 3, and let them figure that out on the easy days for themselves. And generally stick to the guidelines. But, certainly Tom was in the, 30 plus hour weeks frequently.
Damn. All right. Well, I can't let you go. I have a few more things I want to touch on before we go, but I really want to hear what it was like for you during the race. This might be a good time to talk about the race management side of things too, which of course you really couldn't help with in all likelihood. It's sort of up to the athletes at that point, but it was a hard day. So maybe share what was going on in between your ears for that, whatever it was, 23 hours that Tom and Ruth were out on the course. What was it like for you to observe them both in their element at the highest level?
Well, I was, fortunate. I was in the car with Martin for most of the race, and Martin and Ruth have such a dialed, aid station program that I was watching from afar. I mean, I really feel that my job as the coach is finished when we start the taper. I mean, I make suggestions like with the taper for Tom this year was almost identical to the year that he won Western States in terms of the way we reduced the load over those couple of weeks leading into the race. Ruth, we made the taper a little harder, but like once we get into the tapering period, I feel like they have the steering wheel at that point because they're the ones who need to be feeling how they're feeling very closely every day and adjusting it. So my work is essentially done once all the money's in the bank or the hay's in the barn, before we start the taper. And when we get to race day, all I'm trying to do is stay out of the way. Like in the pre-race meetings I had with Tom and Ruth, I was an observer. I wasn't butting into, talking about what Joseph or Paul Booth was going to be saying or doing. It's like, no, I'm curious, I'm listening, but I know that once that, I'm just out there riding around in the car with Martin, keeping him company and being excited. It was a very exciting day for me, for sure.
All right. Well, share more about the emotional side of things. I mean, seeing them both win, was it surreal or was it an unsurprising manifestation of what you had seen in training? I mean, it had to have been a really amazing moment for you.
Oh, absolutely. It was definitely the high point in my coaching career. I think that I knew they were both capable. Their fitness was at a level, they were both capable of pulling something like this off. But as you know certainly better than I do, a whole lot of things can go sideways out there in a 20-hour race. And so you just never know what's going to happen. And so the fact that all the stars did align was really exciting for me to see. Once we got, at a certain stage for both of them, I thought they're going to win this race because I knew they were going to finish strong. And they were going to get stronger as the race went on, and we can see that from their data, heart rate data and pace data compared to previous years. So I was quite confident that they had the race, unless they fell down and hurt themselves. The chances of them winning were quite good, but that didn't lessen the impact at all. And I have to say, having worked with a number of elite athletes in my life, some of them aren't the nicest people, but Tom and Ruth are just the most gracious, generous, and kind people I've dealt with at high level athletics. And the fact that Tom came back to the finish line for Ruth's finish, for the three of us to be there together, speaks volumes about the kind of person he is.
Totally.
I mean, I didn't expect to see him. I had no idea he was going to be there. I didn't think he would be there. I mean, he just ran 108 miles. He's going to be back in his apartment with his legs up and resting and taking a well-deserved break. And I was near the finish line and had to convince the people at the finish line that maybe I should be allowed to go into the finish area. That took some arm twisting, actually. Luckily, Joseph was there and spoke French. But then I looked over my shoulder, and there's Tom. And that really was one of the highlights for me, was the fact that he had made the effort to come back to be there for that spectacular finish. So
awesome. A team effort. It brings up, I don't know, I was just thinking both of their race execution was actually surprisingly similar in that they started asserting themselves as the front runners in the race at about the Grand Col Ferret.
Yes.
Is there anything significant there? Because to me, it's like, well, maybe this is where the muscular endurance really started to show after 105K, still in the darkness of the early morning on the Italian side. This is where all those hours on the Stairmaster, on the uphill treadmill with the weight vest really started to show up. Is there anything there that would be interesting?
Absolutely. That, and where the poles really began to play a bigger role, because the poles, believe it or not, even though maybe you're only putting, 20 pounds per pole plant, that saves your legs. That's 20 pounds your legs aren't having to deal with. Yeah. And so they both were, and Tom, on this debrief I just was doing with him, he said every time he looked over his shoulder going up the Grand Col Ferret, he had another 50 meters on whoever was behind him. And he said it was all the poles, that he just felt so strong on that. And then what that allowed them to do, both the fatigue resistance in their legs, but then saving their legs a bit with using the poles. Once they got on the more runnable sections, they still had the legs to go. And their legs weren't trashed like a lot of people's are. And that was one of Ruth's real benefits last year. The fact that she still had legs, like going up to the Flégère. She still had her highest heart rate in that race was on the last climb up to the Flégère.
That's so crazy.
And I don't know if I looked at this last year after that race. She was 4 minutes faster than the winning man on the downhill from Flégère to the finish line because she still had legs. And I think that goes back to this, kind of going full circle to this fatigue resistance and muscular endurance. I mean, if you still have legs and you can run and you can get your heart rate high, then you're going to perform well at the end of the race. And as you, again, know far better than I do, these races aren't won in the first half. They're really won in the second half of the race. It's very rare that someone goes off the line and, blows away the competition. It's usually, it's the last man standing kind of a thing in that second half of the race. And certainly that Grand Col Ferret is a big climb, quite a test.
Okay, so last thing before we get to our closing question, I just think it would be interesting because it feels to me like a lot of your coaching success has been following a curiosity, and a lot of it has been self-education. I'm sure a lot of people after listening to this will be interested to maybe go on their own learning journey as it relates to training theory and stuff. Is there any places you would point our audience to who are interested to learn more about specifically what you do, or how to, be a coach or to train better themselves?
Sure. Well, so one of the things that I feel like Evoke Endurance is real focus is education. Because I had to learn this myself and figure it all out, and I realized there was a lot of terrible information out there about training. And so everything we have on our website is free. There's no paywalls, because we're trying to get this information out there to help people perform better. And the same with the book. I mean, the book costs something, but the reason that we call it a manual is we want people to use it to refer back to. It's not a quick read. So many people say, I had to read your book 3 times, or this section read 3 times to really understand it. So, because what I've tried to do in the book and in the articles on the website and the podcast is to kind of compile my learned experiences, the things that I had to find, a little piece of it over here and then a little piece over there, like the importance of this aerobic base. Why is it so important that endurance athletes do such a huge volume of low intensity training? That was never clear to me, even when I was younger and an athlete myself. But it is very important. And why? And so I tried to explain that in these books for people. And then on the website, I have a bibliography. These were the kind of the germane areas. These are some of the books that I read that helped me figure some of this stuff out. So and then we do a podcast every month called the Ask Evoke, where people can just write in questions. Happy to try to answer them. Some of them are
You're going to have to make that weekly from now on, Scott. I think
I don't think we have the capacity
up
for
the
that.
Cadence.
Yeah, I don't know that we have the capacity for that.
For our audience,
so
we had a lot of technical issues just trying to get this podcast going at the beginning. Not necessarily Scott's fault, both of us, but yeah, you got to get that podcast going.
Well, we're a pretty simple outfit, but I do think that I do feel like, I had an athletic career that was very important in my life as a young person. Now I'm 72 years old. I'm never going to be competing, like this again. I want to be able to give something back. And I wish that I'd had access to some of this kind of information, or a place to go ask these kinds of questions, like, well, why are we doing this that way? And why don't we do it this way? That sort of thing. And so that's really, we're a coaching business for sure, but education is kind of the big picture of what we want to do.
Awesome. I'm going to make sure to include links in the show notes to the bibliography, to the podcast, et cetera, so our audience can go down their own rabbit hole and embark on their own learning journey.
But Scott, I would encourage people real quickly, though. Be curious. There is, nothing I've talked about in the books or here today that I invent. There's no secrets to this stuff. It's all out there. It's just a matter of, digging for it and finding it and looking in maybe the less obvious places, like the Soviet Union.
Which leads elegantly to our closing question here that we ask everybody. Scott, who is one person that you admire? It can be inside or outside of sport, living or dead. Why do you admire that person?
Well, I'm going to go back to keeping this in the topic that we've been covering most here about fatigue resistance and muscular endurance. I believe the granddaddy of this idea is a Soviet sports scientist who's now dead named Yuri Verkhoshansky. And he was heavily influential on my thinking early on. And the first time I used his principles, when the Soviet Union fell apart, he began to go out and sell his knowledge all over the world. And unfortunately, he doesn't speak English, but his daughter, who also has a PhD in exercise science, does. She translated a lot of his books and his writing. But every place the guy went was successful. The first stop after he left the Soviet Union, he'd been coaching their middle distance runners and then their throwers and jumpers. And I don't know if any of you, if people here follow ballet, but he trained the great Rudolf Nureyev, the Russian ballet guy who could jump incredibly high. There's a picture in one of Verkhoshansky's book of one of the high jumpers he trained touching the rim of a basketball hoop with his foot. I mean, the guy could teach people to jump. So he's also the inventor of plyometrics. And I began to just find all the books and pieces I could read about with him. The first place he went was the Dutch women's volleyball team, who suddenly became the best in the world. Next, he moved to the German rowing team, who suddenly were winning all the gold medals in the Olympics. Next, he moved to the Italian distance running program, and they all of a sudden, in the 90s, began to produce some of the best runners in the world. And he's written several books, some of which are in that bibliography. And he was very influential for me. The first time I used his ideas was I was training a friend of mine who was a two-time Olympian in cross-country skiing, and we started doing this muscular endurance training in 1992, I believe, for the 92 Olympics. And I couldn't believe what a powerful training effect it had for myself and I was doing the workouts with my buddy, and I just went, holy shit, I've never done anything like this. Hope I can say shit. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Anyway, so I think Verkhoshansky He's the father of much of what we know in the West now about strength training. But one of his books, which is I would highly recommend to people, it's called The Special Strength Training Manual for Coaches. And it ain't just about strength. There's a whole section in about training endurance athletes, and it's very well done. But if you think my book is heavy reading, you better be prepared, because you'll have to read each page several times.
Somehow the most obscure and the best answer I've ever heard to this question here is Soviet coach and sports scientist. And I'm eager to now look this guy up and go down my own rabbit hole here. Scott, it's really great to chat with you, man. Congratulations on this amazing moment for you, for Evoke, for your athletes, first and foremost. I hope you really have a chance to absorb their achievements and your contributions to their amazing success. I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing so much of your wisdom.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity, Dylan. Thank you. It was great having. As you can tell, I get pretty worked up talking about this stuff. It's definitely a passion for me.
It comes across. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thanks.